One of the first modern institutions to take on the role of a central bank was Genoa's Bank of St. George. The pedigree of this particular institution, which was ultimately the banker for both Imperial France and Imperial Spain, starts off with Genoa's defeat by Venice in the War of Chioggia. So there had been significant problems for the Genoese following their defeat. Effectively, the city itself was bankrupt. There were all kinds of problems with them being able to meet their obligations, and so the city's leading bankers, those who had supplied money to the state to wage this war, ultimately ended up taking effective control over the finances of the city. They didn't dominate it politically, but what they did is they transformed the debts of the state into the rights to collect the state's revenue and siphon off a regular dividend from it. And this is how the Bank of St. George came to be, or the Casa de San Giorgio in Italian. Don't hunt me down because my Italian's bad. That's just the actual name. Now, it's worth noting that the Bank of St. George, unlike other contemporaries in places like Florence or Venice, was neither state-run nor family-run organization, making it a truly institutional bank. Anyone at all was allowed to make deposits, which made it available to the public, unlike organizations like the Medici Bank that were active during the 15th century as well. Shares in the Bank of St. George were publicly traded. There was an opportunity not only to deposit with the bank, but to buy shares in the organization. And we actually even see a market that develops for dividends on that are being expected to be paid on its shares. And these effectively begin to circulate as a form of currency in Genoa, with the expectation that they are basically short-term debts from the most creditworthy organization within the city. Now, in general, the Bank of St. George engaged in very prudent management, and it had widespread ownership. And as a result, it was very difficult for any given individual party to either threaten the security of it or to dominate its decision-making. And this encouraged its prestige all throughout Europe. It ultimately ended up attracting the businesses of various royal and noble families, for example, the Habsburgs in Spain or the Bourbons in France. For a while, it actually closed its doors to the public to focus specifically on its government clients, the Spanish Empire. From 1557 to 1622, they didn't do any business with the public and focused entirely on being the exclusive banker for Imperial Spain during a period when Spain was earning dramatic amounts of money from its plunder of the New World. So the Bank of Genoa during that period acted as the clearing agent for all of the Spanish gold and silver that had been plundered and ultimately routed it through other traders onto the providers of luxury goods that were coming from the Middle East and the Far East. Now, unfortunately for the Bank of St. George, it lasted just a little over 4 centuries, but was ultimately brought low by geopolitical difficulties with its primary client. Towards the end of the 18th century, the most important client of the Bank of St. George were the Bourbon family of Imperial France. And after their losses in the 7 Years' War, partway through the 18th century, and then towards the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution, ultimately led to a massive erosion of the Bank of St. George's capital. There has been some suggestion that it was rival bankers from Geneva who helped to finance the French Revolution, partly to destroy the Bank of St. George. But needless to say, the ultimate nail in their coffin was the Napoleonic invasion in 1805, when the French simply rolled into northern Italy, and the Bank of St. George was ordered to close its doors. Now, the next interesting bank for us to discuss in that regard is the Bank of England. The Bank of England was founded in 1694 in a similar sort of way that the Bank of St. George was founded. The Bank of England, instead of being created necessarily as a government entity, was instead created to serve the government as its primary client. So the Bank of England originally was established to help to rationalize the government's debts. There had been a revolution in England in 1688. They had actually invited the Dutch to invade them, and the Dutch won. So the parliamentarian faction that had invited in the Dutch very quickly got to remolding the English financial system to resemble the Dutch financial system. And this meant reestablishing a firm currency, recoining the money that was in circulation, and establishing a large bank that would help to facilitate the government's needs for transfers. So the Bank of England was organized as a purely private outfit at this time. It was owned by shareholders who had purchased pieces of the bank. The bank's primary assets at the time were government debt. Effectively, what they had done is purchased up government debt and repackaged it as a stream of dividends that equity investors in the bank would collect. Now, one of the things that the bank managed to do while it was negotiating its privileges with the government was a particularly important one about limiting competition. As we'll see when we talk about corporations, many English companies and many early modern companies strove to establish monopolies over particular businesses. This was seen as the only way of ensuring profits over time. And as a result, the Bank of England itself wanted to secure a monopoly on the government's business. So they became the exclusive fiscal agent of the government of England. And at the same time, they managed to get a monopoly passed that no other organization resembling a bank or in the nature of a bank could be formed within 20 miles of the capital of London. Now, over time, this seems to expand outwards. And we actually find that the development of English banking is severely constrained in the early 1700s by the existence of the Bank of England and its monopoly provisions. Comparatively, the Scots, who join up with the British and form the United Kingdom in 1707, are the real, aggressive bankers of the 1700s, not so much the English. And this is due, again, to the Bank of England's dominance over the market. But these monopoly provisions start to get repealed by the time we get halfway through the 19th century. By 1844, the Bank of England has moved from being a commercial entity that also engages in lending, not just to the government, but also to private enterprises, and shifts more towards being a bank for other bankers. From the banking lecture, you'll hopefully remember that throughout the 1800s, we saw the emergence of small savings banks, we saw the emergence of industrial captive banks as well, and the Bank of England starts to take them in turn as its clients. So it's working with the government and it's working with other banks. So effectively, it stops working directly with corporations and stops working directly with individuals and focuses entirely on its functions as a lender of last resort, on clearing interbank payments, and on issuing a sound currency. Now, it's worth noting from 1844 to 1914 that the Bank of England's notes, or the circulating paper currency, was convertible into gold at a fixed rate. And because England at the time was the most dominant power in the world, and its empire used Bank of England notes all throughout the various hemispheres, that other other countries that wanted to trade with England also ended up adopting a gold standard to facilitate exchange with the largest economic empire in the world at the time. And this helps to create the international gold standard that so many people are familiar with. Effectively, the international gold standard was led by the Bank of England and followed by others. Now, following World War II, as you may be aware, Britain was nowhere near the kind of globe-striding colossus that it once had been. After two devastating wars that effectively brought the country to its knees, the government of England ultimately ended up nationalizing the bank by 1946, needing to have more direct control over the bank's policies in order to encourage the return to economic prosperity. To this day, it remains 100% controlled by the state, but following on the suggestions that central bank independence led to lower inflation because there was less interference from politicians, they were granted policy-making independence in 1997. So even though the Bank of England was once the most important central bank in the world, it is much reduced today. And what's most important about it, though, is perhaps its legacy and the fact that it became a model for a number of other central banks that spread around the world in its aftermath. Other important central banks from that same period include the Nederlands Bank, which is the Dutch central bank, and we also see, interestingly enough, the development of the National Bank of Belgium. Now, both of these have interesting stories related to them that help to illustrate some of the kinds of challenges associated with getting a central bank up and on its feet. So after Napoleon was defeated the first time in 1812, there was a conference held to reestablish the territories and countries that he had conquered, including the Netherlands. So in the newly formed Netherlands in 1813, the British helped to put a Dutch king from the House of Orange back on the throne, and the Dutch king very quickly decided that it was important to establish a central bank. So in 1814, they decided to attempt to create a new bank, one that would be a state-led institution that the state would have the ability to borrow freely from. Now, the Dutch, who traditionally were very strong, you might say, economists, traders, bankers, etc., resisted this. There was a lot of concern among the merchant community that the king would simply use the new proposed central bank as a slush fund to borrow as they wanted from the deposits of the various businesses and companies who would ultimately be its clients. And so when the king tried to raise enough capital to start the Nederlands Bank, what they found was that it had been largely boycotted by the existing banking community in the country. And there was a very real possibility that they weren't going to be able to successfully launch for lack of a sufficient amount of capital. Interestingly enough, famous investor Joanna Borski from the Netherlands helped to make the NDB a real possibility by providing at the last minute a massive amount of extra capital, which would ultimately allow the Netherlands Bank to succeed. So she effectively broke from the boycott of the rest of the banking community to support this venture, but under strict provisions. She insisted that the King of the Netherlands not issue any additional shares in the NDB, and that she be the exclusive one who could sell her shares over the next 3 years, meaning that the king held his position, other investors held their position, but if any new investors wanted to own a piece of the central bank, they would specifically have to buy it from her. And this held. Once the rest of the merchants in Amsterdam and bankers started to realize that the NDB was going to take off because Borski had supported it, they quickly collapsed. Their entire front of trying to resist the new central bank falls apart. And instead, they find themselves rushing to participate in the financing of this organization so that they too can own a piece of it and collect on some of the profits that their business will bring it. What they discover is that the only person they can buy shares from is the widow Borski, who makes herself a very tidy sum of profit off of helping to establish the new Dutch central bank, which persists to this day. Now, the Dutch Central Bank was originally a public company. Shares were publicly traded until 1948, but since that time it has been nationalized, and the government is now the sole shareholder of the NDB, or the DNB rather. Another interesting central bank that had some difficulties emerging was the Belgian Central Bank, the National Bank of Belgium. Belgium was born out of revolution, sort of breaking free from the Netherlands in the 1830s. But one of the things that they had difficulty with was establishing not only a sort of political unity within the country, which was half Flemish and half Walloons, which is roughly to say half Dutch people and half French people. So they had political conflicts within the country itself, which made it challenging. But they also had a problem that they had no large indigenous bank that could serve as a central bank. So Belgian society during this time in the 1830s and 1840s is largely dominated by French banking giant Société Générale. However, the Bank of Belgium, finally established in 1835, to try to support the government directly. The government of Belgium did not take kindly to being under the thumb of foreign bankers and felt that it was important to establish their own bank. The problem was that this bank failed to meet its obligations and suspended payments in 1839, 42, and 1848, which ultimately led to the Bank of Belgium being removed from its privileged position and a new central bank appearing called the National Bank of Belgium. So in 1850, this new version of the central bank emerges with a couple of key changes. First off, as opposed to being a purely public corporation, the National Bank of Belgium would be headed by an appointee of the king, but it would otherwise be run and owned entirely by private shareholders. So in this way, the government had a measure of control over what happened at the central bank, but the economic profits of the central bank were still being held by private shareholders. And just like the Netherlands, this was true until 1948, but unlike the Netherlands, the Belgian government only ended up taking control of half of the shares of the bank. And to this day, it's still possible for individual investors to buy shares in Belgium's central bank, giving this a very different sort of approach than what we see with the fully nationalized Bank of England or DNB. One other early development in central banking that I think is worth considering is the rise of the Sveriges Reichsbank, which is the oldest surviving central bank that we have today. It was originally created as the Bank, which is a sort of its predecessor, but it ultimately had its name changed over to the Sveriges Reichsbank several years later after the the Swedish Parliament established primacy over the bank's direction. Originally, the bank, although founded early on in 1668, it did operate for its first 20 years as a distant private institution, you might say. Um, it was organized by the state, but operated to a large extent at arm's length. Its governance included a wide range of people, the traditional members of the parliamentary system. So, in this sense, it was a central bank born not entirely of private investors like the Bank of England or the Bank of St. George, but instead was created to some extent by the government. There had been a private bank that had acted to some extent before it, the Stockholm Banco, but this bank had failed. And as a result, the government, realizing it needed a fiscal agent, had created the Riksbank that became Sveriges Riksbank. So this is where we see the first government-created central bank appearing. And it doesn't take them very long for the absolute monarch of Sweden at the time to seize direct control. There is a sense that the king has primacy over all aspects of the state, and that includes the central bank and its ability to issue money. The problem was that for these 30 years where the king had direct control over the central bank, he effectively looted the central bank to wage a series of wars, which he promptly lost. In 1709, redemptions from the central bank had to be frozen, and it was literally people could get their money back out of the central bank. So when absolute monarchy is finally overthrown in 1719 in Sweden, what we see is that the parliament takes control once again and widens the governance base once again in order to encourage more stakeholders to have a say in what the policies of the bank should be. Now, what's interesting about the Sveriges Riksbank is that unlike other central banks who might have preferred monetary stability, they were actually legally committed to price stability until 1897, which is particularly important. Their idea was that for over 150 years, the Sveriges Riksbank was required by law to maintain whatever policies that would ensure the stability of their currency. So again, we can see the strength of the government playing through a central bank in this case. No longer is the government simply standing by and being served by private shareholders. It has stepped into the role of central banker itself to some extent. Now, the next banks that we see that are born directly of the state are in fact America's first and second bank of the United States. The first one founded in 1791 lasted 20 years, and then 5 years after the expiration of its charter, a second central bank of the United States was created. This also only lasted 20 years and was finally sort of driven out by a failure to renew its charter, which left America with a very challenging system between 1836 and 1913 when it finally reestablishes another central bank, the Federal Reserve System. So it's worth noting a little bit of the design of the first and second central bank of the United States to sort of be able to appreciate how the design and governance of these institutions has been evolving over the last few centuries. So the first and second bank of the United States had shares that were sold to the general public, but governance of the firm remained strictly in the hands of American citizens. Even though 75% of the shareholders of the first bank of the United States were foreigners, it turned out that they couldn't vote, and only the 25% of shareholders who were actually American were allowed to vote. The government itself did retain a 20% stake in the capital of the first and second bank of the United States, but the other 80% was owned by a diversified body of shareholders, which tended to average between about 3,000 and 6,000 people, depending on the year. Now, one of the things that we see is that this creates a significant sort of problem in America. Americans are traditionally concerned about concentrations of economic power, for instance, as represented by the Bank of England. They traditionally prefer to have a dispersed banking system. And as a result, there was a lot of political pushback against the notion of building their own domestic Bank of England, which would allow money centers to necessarily dominate the rest of the country, determining the flow of capital from one place to another. And so, due to this particular fear, there was a significant backlash against the entire notion of a central bank, regardless of the economic merits that things like banking stability would necessarily provide for. So we do see that America between 1836 and 1913 experiences a wave of financial crises that seem to emerge every decade or two, generally due to some kind of bank failure, which ultimately the government didn't really have the tools to control. It isn't until the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913, in response to a crisis in 1907, that we see America finally deciding for itself that central banking is an important aspect of managing their economy. And so since 1913, America has used the Federal Reserve System to act as their central bank.